There are things that get buried not because they were lost, but because someone very deliberately put them in the ground and walked away. Daniel had spent nearly 3 decades working as a records archivist for a regional hospital network, and in all that time, he had never found anything that made him sit down on a dusty concrete floor and just stare at a wall. Until the afternoon, he opened a box that was never supposed to still exist. It was a routine clearance job. The old storage wing of the administrative building was being converted into office space, and someone had to go through the physical records before the contractors showed up with their drills and their drywall. Most of it was exactly what you would expect. Billing ledgers, staff rosters, equipment maintenance logs so old the ink had faded to a pale brown ghost of itself. Daniel moved through box after box with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Dust in his nose, the faint smell of old paper that always reminded him, strangely, of dried leaves, the low hum of a single fluorescent tube somewhere above him, flickering every few minutes like it was thinking about giving up entirely. The box looked ordinary. Cardboard, slightly warped at one corner from moisture at some point in its long life, labeled on the side with a handwritten code in black marker. Daniel almost set it aside with the rest of the routine archive material. Almost. But something about the label made him pause. The code was formatted differently from everything else he had processed that day. And underneath the code, in smaller handwriting that looked like it had been added later by a different hand, were 4 words. Nutrition cohort. Restricted. Access. He opened it. Inside was a single folder, thicker than it looked from the outside. The papers were organized with a precision that felt almost obsessive. Intake forms, measurement logs, follow-up schedules. A column on the right side of each intake sheet listed something under the heading Supplement Protocol, and in that column, repeated on page after page after page, was a 2-word entry that Daniel read 3 times before he fully understood what he was looking at. Isotope administered. He sat down on the floor. The fluorescent light flickered. Outside in the hallway, he could hear someone on a phone call, laughing at something. The sound felt very far away. He sat there with the folder open across his knees and read the names, dozens of them, women's names first and last, written in careful cursive. Next to each name, a date of their clinic visit. Next to each date, a dosage figure. And at the top of the first page, a single line that would stay lodged in his mind for months afterward like a splinter he could not reach. Subjects enrolled in standard prenatal care. Informed consent not required under program classification. He did not tell anyone that afternoon. He carried the folder to his car under his jacket, which was not protocol, which was technically a serious breach of his archival responsibilities, and which he would later describe as the first genuinely honest thing he had done in years. He sat in the parking lot for a long time before he started the engine. The folder was on the passenger seat. He kept glancing at it the way you glance at something you are not sure is real yet. The names were real. The dosages were real. Whatever had been put into those women's bodies decades ago had been measured and recorded and filed away with the same calm administrative tidiness as a linen inventory. He drove home wondering how many of those women were still alive, wondering how many of them had ever been told, already knowing, somewhere in the part of his mind that had spent 3 decades learning how institutions work, that the answer to both questions was almost certainly the same, almost none. If this story is already making the hairs on your arms stand up, you are not alone. Share it and subscribe so more people get to hear what was buried in that box. The next morning, Daniel called in sick for the first time in 4 years. He spread the folder across his kitchen table and started at the beginning. Not the beginning of the file itself, but further back. He needed to understand the world that had produced it, so he started searching, and what he found was not one story. It was the architecture of an entire system. The clinics in question had operated across several communities during a stretch of time that Daniel's research kept circling back to like water finding a drain. They were free clinics, the kind that existed to fill the gap between people who could afford a doctor and people who absolutely could not. That gap in those communities was enormous. The clinics were staffed by real medical professionals. They offered genuine prenatal care, genuine checkups, genuine concern. Women came in because they had nowhere else to go, and because going somewhere, anywhere, felt better than the alternative of managing a pregnancy entirely alone with no support and no information and no one checking whether the baby's heartbeat was where it should be. Daniel found a photograph online from a local historical archive, a black and white image of one of the clinic waiting rooms. Wooden chairs lined up along a wall, a window with thin curtains, a corkboard on the far wall with printed information sheets pinned to it, and women, sitting quietly, some of them visibly pregnant, some of them young enough that the pregnancy looked almost impossible to believe, all of them waiting with the particular patience of people who have learned not to expect things to move quickly for them. He stared at that photograph for a long time. The intake process at the clinics, as described in the records, was warm and thorough. A nurse would greet each new patient, take her basic details, check her blood pressure, ask about her diet. Standard stuff. Reassuring stuff. The kind of interaction designed to make a nervous first-time patient feel like she was in safe hands. And at the end of that initial appointment, before the woman left, she would be given a small container of liquid. A supplement, she was told, something to support her nutritional levels during the pregnancy, something to help the baby develop properly. The nurses, according to the intake notes Daniel was reading, described it as a formula. Simple, helpful, routine. Not a single intake form contained a patient signature acknowledging what the formula contained. Not one. Daniel checked them twice. He checked a third time because he genuinely could not believe what he was not seeing. In decades of archival work, he had processed consent forms for procedures far less significant than introducing an isotope into a pregnant woman's body. The absence of any consent documentation was not an oversight. It was a choice. Someone at some level of this program had decided that these women did not need to know what they were drinking and had built the paperwork around that decision so cleanly that it left almost no visible seam. He closed the folder. He made coffee he did not drink. He stood at his kitchen window looking out at the street, at a neighbor walking a dog, at a kid on a bicycle, at the completely ordinary morning happening outside his window, and he thought about all those women sitting in all those wooden chairs, holding small containers of something they had been told was good for them, trusting completely because trust was the only reasonable response to a medical professional in a clean room who smiled and said, "This will help." The folder was still on the table behind him. The names were still in it. And somewhere out there, Daniel was almost certain, were families who had spent years living with questions that this folder contained the answers to and who had no idea it existed. The folder had a reference number stamped on its inside cover, and that reference number led Daniel to something he was not expecting. Published papers, real ones, peer-reviewed, university-affiliated, printed in respected medical journals that still existed and could still be found in online academic databases. He spent the better part of that second day at his kitchen table with his laptop open next to the folder, moving between the two like a translator working between two languages, and what he found was this. The science described in those papers was not fake. It was not the work of someone operating in the shadows with no credentials and no oversight. It was careful, methodical, genuinely sophisticated research into how the body processes nutrients during pregnancy. The kind of research that, if you read it without knowing what you now know, would seem not just acceptable, but actually valuable. That was the part that kept stopping him cold. The method described in the papers used radioactive tracers, specific isotopes that the body could not distinguish from their non-radioactive equivalents, to follow the path of a nutrient from ingestion through absorption and into the developing tissue of the fetus. It was, in the purely technical sense, an elegant solution to a genuinely difficult measurement problem. Regular nutrients are invisible once they enter the body. You cannot tell which atoms came from a supplement and which were already there. But a radioactive version sends a signal. A detectable, measurable, trackable signal. You give the subject the tracer, you draw blood at intervals, you measure the signal, and you build a precise map of exactly how the nutrient moves through the body. Clean data, reproducible results, the kind of methodology that gets a paper accepted without much argument. Daniel found himself reading one particular paper 3 times, slowly, because there was something deeply disorienting about it. The writing was calm and precise. The conclusions were modest and carefully worded. The acknowledgments section thanked the university, the funding agency, and the clinic staff for their cooperation. And buried in the methodology section, in one sentence that sat between 2 much longer sentences about measurement intervals and blood sample processing, was this: participants were not informed of the specific composition of the supplement in order to prevent bias and self-reporting. One sentence, passive voice, no explanation, no justification. Just a quiet statement of fact, slipped between the technical details like a stone dropped into deep water, barely making a ripple on the surface. He looked up the lead author, Dr. Alan Mercer. The search results came back immediately, and they were extensive. A long career at a well-regarded university, multiple published books on nutritional medicine, a named professorship, a string of awards from medical associations whose names Daniel recognized, a photograph on a university memorial page because Mercer had died some years earlier, showed a man in his late 60s with white hair and wire-rimmed glasses and an expression of mild, intelligent calm. He looked like someone who gave thoughtful answers at dinner parties. He looked like someone you would trust immediately and without much thought. Daniel sat with that photograph for a while. There was a building on a university campus, somewhere with this man's name on it. Students walked past it every day without any idea what was in the folder Daniel had pulled from a box scheduled for destruction. That thought settled into him like cold water. The funding trail was the next thread. It took Daniel the rest of the afternoon to follow it, moving through publicly accessible grant records and old university budget documents that had been digitized as part of a historical archive project. What he found confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. The research was not self-funded. It had not been organized by a single ambitious doctor working independently. It had been supported by a government science agency with formal approval at multiple institutional levels. The grant applications were thorough and professionally written. The ethical review, such as it was under the standards of the time, had been conducted and signed off. Every box that needed to be checked had been checked by real people with real authority who looked at this program and decided it was fine. That was the moment Daniel understood something that changed the shape of everything he had been looking at. This was not a story about a rogue scientist. It was not a story about one bad actor who slipped through a system that was otherwise working correctly. The system itself had looked at this program, at these women, at those intake forms with no signature line, and had said yes, had said approved, had said here is your funding, here is your institutional backing, here is your protected file marked restricted access, go ahead and proceed. He closed the laptop. Outside, it was getting dark. He had not eaten since morning. He sat in the dimming kitchen with the folder in front of him and the photograph of Alan Mercer still open on his phone screen, and he thought about something a supervisor had told him early in his career. She had said that the most dangerous decisions in any institution are the ones that go through every proper channel and still come out wrong. Because then nobody did it. And if nobody did it, nobody has to answer for it. He looked at the folder. Someone had to answer for it. The question was whether anyone still could. The word that broke Daniel was not a scientific term. It was an ordinary word, one he had used himself 100 times without thinking about it. He found it in one of Mercer's internal memos, the ones that had been tucked into the back of the folder behind the intake forms, clearly never intended to leave the building. The memo was discussing subject selection criteria, and at one point Mercer wrote, in his clean and careful handwriting, that patients receiving subsidized care were a cooperative population. That was the phrase, cooperative population, not because they had agreed to anything, not because they had been asked, but because they were poor and because poor people, in Mercer's calculation, did not make trouble. They were cooperative the way a locked door is cooperative. They did not push back because they did not know there was anything to push back against. Daniel read that phrase and then stood up and walked to the kitchen window and stood there for probably 2 full minutes, not thinking anything coherent at all, just breathing. The street outside was the same as it always was. A woman walking with a stroller, a delivery van idling at the curb, everything completely normal. He went back to the memo. There were 3 of them in total, the internal memos, and together they functioned like a private conversation between people who knew exactly what they were doing and had made their peace with it. The first discussed subject selection, the cooperative population language. The second outlined dosage levels and measurement schedules, clinical and precise, nothing in it that would look out of place in any legitimate research document. The third was the one that hit hardest. It was shorter than the others, just a few paragraphs, and it addressed a practical concern that had apparently been raised by someone on the team whose name was redacted in the copy Daniel had. The concern was about follow-up, whether the women should be contacted after the study concluded, whether they should be informed of results. Mercer's response was brief. He wrote that follow-up contact with subjects was not part of the program design, and that given the nature of the research classification, direct communication with participants would be, and this was his exact word, inadvisable, inadvisable. Daniel wrote that word down on a piece of paper and circled it twice. Not unethical, not problematic, not wrong, inadvisable. As though the only real concern was operational tidiness, as though the women on those intake forms were variables in an equation rather than people who might one day wonder why their children got sick. He put the memos back in the folder in the order he had found them, and then he did something he had not done since he was maybe 12 years old. He went and sat on the back step of his house in the cold and just looked at the sky for a while, not thinking. Just letting the cold air do its work, because sometimes the only way to process a thing that big is to make yourself very small and very still and let it settle around you like weather. The next morning he started on the names. He had been avoiding it, he realized. Going through the funding records and the memos and the academic papers was, in a way, easier. Those were documents, abstract. The names on the intake forms were not abstract. They were specific women with specific lives, and as soon as Daniel started cross-referencing them with other records, death certificates, local census data, old hospital admission logs that he could access through his archival credentials, they stopped being a list and started being something much harder to sit with. Some of the women had died young, younger than they should have. Several of them in their 40s and 50s from conditions that their death certificates listed with the neutral language of medicine, conditions that, when Daniel looked them up, shared a particular characteristic. They were the kind of conditions that can be triggered or accelerated by certain types of internal exposure. He was not a doctor. He could not draw a clinical line between the supplement and the outcome, but the pattern across the names was visible enough that it did not feel like coincidence. It felt like a shape, the kind of shape you see when you step back far enough to take in the whole picture rather than just the individual pieces. And then he found Roy. Not directly, not at first. He found a woman named Margaret on the intake list, a name with an address attached in one of the administrative documents, and he found a death record for a Margaret at that same address. And he found, through a local community records database, a next of kin listing. A son, Roy. still at a listed address not far from where his mother had lived. Daniel stared at Roy's name for a long time. This was the moment he had been building toward without quite admitting it to himself. The folder was no longer just a professional discovery. It was someone's family history. And the question that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the storage room, the one he had been too cautious to fully form, finally came forward and stood there plainly. Did Roy know what had happened to his mother? And what would it mean for Roy if he did not? Roy opened the door before Daniel had finished knocking, like he had been standing just on the other side of it, waiting. He was somewhere in his 70s, broad-shouldered in the way that men who worked physical jobs their whole lives tend to stay broad even when everything else softens with age. He looked at Daniel with the specific kind of stillness that people develop when they have spent a long time expecting bad news and have simply run out of the energy to be surprised by it. He did not say hello, he said, "You found something, didn't you?" Not a question, a recognition. Daniel had rehearsed what he was going to say on the drive over. He had thought about how to frame it, how to be careful, how to present the information without overwhelming a man he had never met. All of that preparation dissolved the moment Roy looked at him. He just said yes. Roy stepped back from the door and let him in. The house smelled like wood polish and old coffee and something faintly floral that Daniel eventually traced to a small potted plant on the windowsill. Roy's living room was tidy in the way that suggested habit rather than effort, everything in a specific place, a specific order, the furniture arranged around a central coffee table where Roy had clearly been sitting before the knock came. There was a mug there, still steaming, and next to it a framed photograph face down on the table. Daniel noticed it but said nothing. They sat. Daniel put the folder on the coffee table between them. He walked Roy through it slowly, the intake forms, the dosage columns, the isotope-administered notation, the memos, the published papers. Roy listened without interrupting. He had his hands flat on his knees, and he kept his eyes on the folder rather than on Daniel, the way you look at something you need to understand before you can afford to feel anything about it. When Daniel finished, Roy was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out and turned the photograph on the table, face up. It was a woman, middle-aged in the photo, but young in the way she was smiling, standing in a garden with sunlight catching the edge of her hair. He said, "That's her." "That's my mother, Margaret." He said it simply, like he was just making sure Daniel knew which woman they were talking about. Then he said, "She had a daughter before me, my sister. She was 9 years old." He stopped, started again. "Some kind of tumor. The doctor said they had never seen that type in a child that young. My mother never stopped wondering what she had done wrong. She thought it was something she ate during the pregnancy. She thought it was her fault." He tapped the folder with one finger, very lightly, like he was afraid of it. "And it was something she ate during the pregnancy, wasn't it?" Daniel did not answer because there was no answer that would have been adequate. Roy nodded slowly, to himself more than to Daniel, the nod of a man filing something away in the correct place after a lifetime of not knowing where it belonged. That conversation with Roy changed something in how Daniel was moving through this. Up until that point, even with the names, even with the death records and the pattern he had started to see, the folder had still been primarily a professional discovery. A serious one, a disturbing one, but still something that existed mostly in the realm of documents and data. Roy made it physical. Roy made it the weight of a 9-year-old girl and a mother who spent the rest of her life carrying guilt that was never hers to carry. He drove home a different way than he had come, not intentionally, just not paying close enough attention to the road. He ended up going past an old community building he did not recognize, and something made him pull over and look it up on his phone. It had been, according to a local history site, one of several neighborhood clinics operating in the area during the period covered by the folder. The building was something else now, a community arts center, brightly painted, kids' drawings visible through the ground floor windows. He sat in the car outside it for a few minutes. The same walls, different paint, Nothing on the outside to indicate what had happened inside. That night, he started looking beyond the folder itself, and that was when the real scale of what he was dealing with began to reveal itself. Because the folder, it turned out, was not an isolated document. It was a node in something much larger. Searching through digitized academic archives, Daniel began finding references to similar research programs, different locations, different institutions, but the same fundamental structure: a population with limited access to independent medical advice, a government-backed research interest, a supplement or treatment administered without full disclosure, blood samples taken at follow-up visits and analyzed for tracer levels, and in every case, the same clean absence of any patient consent documentation. He made a list. It grew through the night. By the time the sky outside started going pale at the edges, the list had more than a dozen entries, and he had the distinct and deeply uncomfortable feeling that he was only seeing the programs that had been documented well enough to leave a traceable record. The ones that had been more careful, or whose records had been more thoroughly managed, would not appear in any search. They would simply be gone. The question was not how many programs there were. The question was how many had left nothing behind at all. And then he found Claire's article. A short piece published in a regional health journal several years earlier that described unexplained patterns of illness in communities that had once been served by government-affiliated free clinics. The article was careful and specific and very well sourced. It named no programs directly, but the shape of what it described matched the folder on Daniel's desk with an accuracy that made his throat tighten. At the bottom of the article was Claire's name and a contact email. He looked at the clock. It was not yet 6 in the morning. He opened a new email anyway and started typing. Claire replied in 40 minutes, not later that morning, not the next day. 40 minutes after Daniel sent his email at 6 in the morning, her response was already in his inbox, 2 sentences long. I have been waiting for someone to find that folder for 3 years. Call me. He called her before he had finished reading the message twice. Her voice was the voice of someone who had been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and had gotten very good at not showing it. Calm, precise, a little dry. She asked him exactly which documents he had and listened without interrupting while he described them. When he finished, she said, "The intake forms with the isotope column. I knew those existed. I could never get my hands on them." He asked her how she had known. She said, "Because I found a nurse." A woman who had worked at one of the clinics during the program period, elderly by the time Claire tracked her down, had agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. She had not known the full scope of what the supplements contained. She had been told they were a standard nutritional formula developed in cooperation with a university research team. But she had noticed things. She had noticed that the follow-up blood draws were handled differently from routine prenatal tests. Separate vials, separate labels, collected by a different member of staff and sent to a different processing address. She had asked about it once and been told it was standard protocol for the research component. She had not asked again. But she remembered. She remembered for decades, quietly, the way you remember a thing that did not make complete sense at the time and that you filed away without quite knowing why. Claire had taken that testimony and built her article around the pattern it suggested, careful not to make claims she could not fully document. Her editor had run the piece but killed the follow-up, citing legal concerns about naming institutions without definitive documentary proof. Claire had kept her research files. All of them. She had a box at home, she told Daniel, that contained everything she had gathered over 2 years of work. She had not thrown it out. She said she had not thrown it out because she had never quite been able to believe the story was finished. They met 3 days later at a cafe near Claire's apartment. She brought the box. It was a standard moving box, the kind with the fold-in top, and it was full to the point where closing it required a slight downward pressure on the contents. She set it on the table between them and said, I need you to understand something before we go any further. The institutions involved in this are not small. The people who approved this research are not obscure. When I started pulling on this, I had 2 sources go quiet on me within a week of agreeing to talk. One of them called me back months later and said, and I am quoting him directly here, that he had been strongly advised to let this particular subject rest. She looked at Daniel steadily across the table. I want to know that you understand what that means before we decide what to do with your folder. Daniel understood. He said so. He meant it. He also understood, sitting there with the folder in his bag and Claire's box on the table and the noise of the cafe moving around them like weather, that the moment he sent that email at 6 in the morning, he had already made the decision. He just had not named it yet. What Claire's box contained, when they went through it together over the next several hours, was extraordinary. She had cross-referenced illness records with clinic catchment areas across multiple communities. She had found a consistent pattern of elevated rates of specific conditions in populations that had received care from clinics connected to the research program during the relevant period. She had sourced a partial list of other institutions that had received funding from the same government agency during the same window. She had a copy of an internal review document from one of those institutions that discussed, in elliptical but unmistakable language, the importance of maintaining confidentiality around research methodology in programs involving non-consenting community subjects. Non-consenting. The document used that phrase without apparent awareness of what it meant. The way people use words that have become so normalized inside an institution that their actual meaning has gone invisible. Together, Daniel's folder and Claire's box formed something neither of them had alone. A case, not a suspicion, not a pattern, not a story that could be dismissed as circumstantial. An actual documented case with named subjects, recorded dosages, internal communications, and a paper trail that connected the clinic floor to the funding agency to the published research. They sat with that understanding for a moment, the 2 of them at a small table in a noisy cafe, and neither of them said anything. The weight of it was too specific for small words. It was Claire who finally spoke. She said they needed a lawyer. Not to sue, not yet, but to understand what they were holding and what their obligations were and what the risks looked like going forward. She said she knew someone who had handled cases involving institutional misconduct before and who, in her words, did not frighten easily. Daniel nodded. He picked up his coffee, which had gone completely cold while they worked through the box. He drank it anyway. Some things you just push through regardless of how they taste. The lawyer's name was James, and he met them in his office on a Tuesday afternoon. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away, not because he was cold, but because he had spent a long career learning that reactions have consequences, and that the most useful thing you can do when someone puts something serious in front of you is to look at it clearly before you decide how to feel about it. He read through the key documents without speaking. He asked 3 questions. He sat back in his chair and said, "This is real." Not a question, just a statement of fact, the way a doctor says a diagnosis out loud to confirm it for themselves as much as for the patient. What happened next moved faster than Daniel had expected and slower than he had hoped. The institutions, when contacted through legal channels, did not deny. They did not confirm either. They responded with the practiced non-language of organizations that have legal teams specifically trained to say nothing in as many words as possible. Statements were released acknowledging that historical research practices had evolved significantly over time and that the institutions were committed to current ethical standards. No names, no specifics, no acknowledgement of harm. The non-disclosure settlement offer arrived addressed to Roy before Daniel had even known it was coming, routed through a community outreach office in a way that made it look almost like a routine administrative communication. Roy called Daniel when he received it. His voice was very even. He said, "They want me to sign something that says I won't talk about my mother in exchange for money." A pause. "I'm not going to do that." Daniel said he knew. Roy said, "I want her name said out loud somewhere official. I don't care about the rest of it. I just want someone in a room with authority to say her name and say what happened to her." That was the thing that no settlement could buy, and no legal process had yet delivered, not because it was impossible, because the institutions were betting, correctly based on past experience, that most people would take the money and go quiet, and that time would do the rest of the work for them. They were wrong about Roy, and they had not yet fully understood what Daniel and Claire had built together in that box and that folder. The story was not over. It was, in fact, only now becoming the kind of story that does not stay buried. Daniel went back to the old administrative building one afternoon, back to the storage wing where the contractors had long since finished their work. The space that had held those boxes was now a clean, open-plan office with white walls and new carpet and the faint smell of fresh paint. He stood in the doorway and looked at the space where the box had been sitting. Nothing marked the spot. No sign, no shadow, no indication that anything of significance had ever been stored there. That is how it works, he thought. You clear out the old things, you put up new walls, you repaint, and within a few years, even the people who work there every day have no idea what the room used to hold. But the folder was not in the room anymore. It was in a lawyer's office, copied and cataloged and attached to a formal legal process that would take time, but that would not simply evaporate because an institution preferred silence. The names on those intake forms, Margaret and all the others, were in a document that existed in multiple locations now, that could not be reduced to a single box in a single storage room scheduled for destruction. That was the thing the institutions had not counted on when they filed the folder under restricted access and waited for time to handle it. They had assumed the box would be destroyed before anyone looked inside. They had assumed, the way powerful organizations often assume, that their patience was longer than anyone else's curiosity. They were wrong about that too. Here is what this whole story comes down to, and I want you to sit with it for a second. Every single person involved in that program, from the researchers to the funding agencies to the administrators who signed the approvals, went home at the end of their working day and lived their lives and considered themselves decent people. They were not wearing masks. They were not hiding in shadows. They were operating inside a system that had decided quietly and collectively that some people's bodies were available for use without their knowledge, and that system had dressed that decision in the language of science and public benefit until it no longer looked like what it was. That is not a story about monsters. That is a story about what happens when institutions stop seeing people and start seeing populations. And that distinction between a person and a population is where every large-scale harm in history has started. So here is the question I want you to answer honestly in the comments. If you had been one of the nurses handing out those supplements, following instructions from people with credentials and authority and institutional backing, genuinely believing you were part of something beneficial, would you have questioned it? And if you say yes, what exactly would have made you stop and ask? Because that answer matters more than you might think. If this story made you feel something real, hit the like button and subscribe so the next story that deserves to be heard actually reaches the people who need to hear it.